In this recording we're looking at main verbs and verb phrases and the main distinction between different types of main verbs, transitive and intransitive verbs. Now, within the category of main verbs we can distinguish a number of different subcategories, and of course to look at what the subcategories are we have to look at what kind of constituents occur within the verb phrase, with the verb. And in particular, we have to look at what the complements of the verbs are. Now, as I already said, the main distinction is between transitive and intransitive verbs. Now, we've already come across transitive and intransitive verbs, across that distinction, and that's characterized by whether or not there is a direct object. So transitive verbs are verbs that are followed by a direct object. Intransitive verbs are verbs that are not followed by a direct object. What again is a direct object? Well, we've already learned that a direct object is the noun phrase sister to the verb, and usually that comes immediately to the right of the verb. Now, we have to learn an extra characteristic of direct objects, because that's going to be important in this topic of types of main verbs. And the second characteristic of direct objects is that the noun phrase, the direct object, refers to a separate role player in an event, the event expressed by the verb. Okay, what's a role player? Well, it's the entity that's involved. That's an entity that's involved in an event or an activity. So if you take, for example, eating, as in this picture, you see two entities. There is an eater, there's the boy here, and there is a thing that is eaten. So when you think about eating, it's a relation between two entities. We can say they are two role players in the event of eating. So one plays the role of eater and the other of the thing that is eaten. And we also talk about, in general, saying, okay, the person or the entity doing something is called the agent, and the thing undergoing the action, which is the direct object, is the patient. Okay, so that's how you check for whether there is a direct object. In other words, whether a verb is transitive. So you look if there is a noun phrase sister to the right of the verb, and whether that noun phrase sister is a separate role player. So it's a different individual from the subject. And why that's important we'll see in a moment. Another way of checking is, of course, can you form an echo question? But that doesn't always work. You have to keep in mind that the what part is a separate role player. So he eats what? He eats a corn cob. Of course, another way of checking for a direct object is to try and make the sentence passive, because remember, the direct object in an active sentence becomes the subject in a passive sentence. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples. John kissed that very tall girl. Okay, what's the verb? The verb is kissed. Next to it you get that, and then that very tall girl. So that here is a determiner. He kissed the very tall girl. So it's the start of a noun phrase. So is that very tall girl a separate role player? Well, yes, because it's the individual that John kisses. So you can say John kissed who, and the answer is that very tall girl. And you can make the sentence passive. So you can say that very tall girl was kissed by John. So all those tests show that that very tall girl is the direct object, and that makes the verb kiss a transitive verb. Okay, let's try another one. Mary spoke French in the evenings. You've got spoke as the verb, next to it is French. French is the name of the language, so it's a noun phrase. And you can say, well, that's a separate entity. The language it's of course not an individual as such, but it is an entity. It is a sort of abstract entity. Can you do an echo question? Well, you can say Mary spoke what in the evenings? And the answer is French, so that works. Yeah, and French is of course a separate entity from Mary. Can you make it passive? French was spoken in the evenings by Mary. Yeah, that works as well. So French is a direct object, and that makes spoke or speak a transitive verb. She mentioned the news briefly. She mentioned, and then you get the news. Yes, determine a noun. She mentioned it briefly, so there's a noun phrase next to the verb mentioned. Yeah, it's again a separate, a different entity in this event. Yes, there's she mentioning something, and the news tells you what she mentioned. You can say she mentioned what? The news. That works as well as an echo question. The news was mentioned by her briefly. You can make the sentence passive. So all in all, the news must be the direct object, and that makes mention a transitive verb. Try the next one. They lived on raw meat. Now the verb is lived. Next to it, the word is on, and on is a preposition, so you know that's the start of a prepositional phrase. So then already you can stop there and say, right, there's a prepositional phrase, so there's no direct object, because raw meat is a noun phrase inside the prepositional phrase, and so it's the object of the preposition. It can't be a direct object. So lived is an intransitive verb. Now it gets a bit tricky. We get he was a very clever man. The verb is was, and then after that you get a very clever man. You know, the determiner, degree adverb, adjective, so that's an adjective phrase, and then you get man as a noun. So the whole phrase is a noun phrase, a very clever man. So it looks like a direct object, but now you have to think to yourself, how many role players have you got here? And of course there's he, and a very clever man is not a separate individual, a separate entity in this sentence. So it looks like, although this is a noun phrase, it's not a direct object. Now you can make the sentence passive, or try and make the sentence passive as a test. So you would get a very clever man was being by him. Now that sounds wrong, and it is wrong, and that shows you that a very clever man here, although it's a noun phrase following a verb, it's not actually a direct object. Yeah, that's because it's not a separate entity in the sentence, and you can't make it passive. Yeah, now that's because was here is copula be, and a very clever man here actually expresses a property of the subject. Yeah, it's not an event involving two separate individuals. Okay, now you can see how that differs from the next one. He met a very clever man. Yeah, because then again you've got the verb met followed by a noun phrase, but now you've got two different role players. Yeah, he and a very clever man. And then if you try and make it passive, you get a very clever man was met by him. And that's perfectly fine. So you see that here you do have a direct object.